Welcome to Research Renaissance, presented by the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Embark on a journey into the forefront of cutting-edge brain science as we feature insightful discussions with a diverse array of guests, from early career researchers pioneering groundbreaking science to influential voices in investment communities, policymaking, and research institutions. Together, we delve into neurological diseases, their causes, treatments, and the quest for cures. Join us in advancing our understanding of the brain and addressing its ailments. Welcome to Research Renaissance. I'm Deborah Westphal, your host and guide through the fascinating future of the brain. Joining me today is Dr. Carrie Wolinetz, a distinguished science and health policy expert. Carrie has held significant positions, including NIH Associate Director for Science Policy, Acting Chief of Staff to the NIH Director, and Deputy Director for Health and Life Sciences at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Today, we will be discussing the future of medical research. So welcome, Carrie.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm very appreciative of you being here and with the possibility of just kind of shedding some light on some of the things that are going on right now, which is towards the end of February 2025. And so thank you for making the time. I would like to just kind of to jump in because you've had a fascinating career spanning science policy, research administration, and ethics too, the topic of ethics. What drew you to this intersection of science and policy, and what are some of the pivotal moments in your journey and that shaped your career?
Well, I think the thing that drew me to science policy in some ways was the same thing that drew me to science in the first place. So I started my career once upon a time as a scientist. I have a doctoral degree in animal science and reproductive biology. And I really wanted to solve problems, which is really at the end of the day what science is all about. And I realized while I was in the lab that in some ways the problems I was looking at were too incremental for me. What I found myself attracted to were bigger picture problems, really things at the intersection of science and society, thinking about problems in the enterprise of science itself. And so I realized pretty early on in my career that I was more interested in science policy than research science. And so I guess the first big moment in my career was moving down to Washington, D.C. and trying to find a policy position in science. And my very first job was for a scientific society, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, which exists today, FASIB. They're a coalition of scientific societies. And that was a great place to start my career because I got to learn about a huge number of issues across the waterfront of biomedical research. So everything about federal funding, different policy issues, regulatory issues, a lot about how we think about communicating science to the public in ways that are effective for influencing policymakers. And so it was a great place to cut my teeth in the world of science policy. And from there, I went on to other organizations that represented research universities before entering federal service at the National Institutes of Health, which is another major turning point because prior to that, I had really been in the advocacy world, really making the case to policymakers about why science and research and the perspectives of scientists and research universities were really important in these national policy conversations. And one of the things you realize when you enter public service is you're not representing any one constituency. You're working for all of the American taxpayers, and they have a variety of perspectives on any given issue, sometimes as many as over 300 million perspectives, because that's how many Americans we have, and trying to find those solutions that really supported the interests of the country was a really exciting and meaningful place to be.
Can you explain kind of that transition or that translation rather, because science is so, it's it's hardcore, right? There's a process, and we go through the scientific method and all that. But what is that relationship to policy, and why is that important? Because maybe people don't understand what science policy really is.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's start a little bit backwards. What is science policy? And there are a couple of ways to think about that. There is the concept of science policy in the sense of sometimes scientific evidence informs policy. So, for example, if you wanted to set regulations about chemicals in drinking water, it's important to have scientific evidence about the impact of those chemicals on human health or the environment. In that case, it's really about science informing policy. Whereas what I worked on a lot was science policy in the sense of policy that really informed science. So, how do we build a federal enterprise through funding, through policies, through ethical considerations that really return the investments that we were making in federally funded science, in this case of the National Institutes of Health, back to the American taxpayer in a way that informed human health. So the mission of the National Institutes of Health, of course, is to support fundamental research and clinical research that ultimately is about advancing human health and improving the quality of all of our lives. And a lot of what I thought about is how do we create the processes, the rules, the ethical guidelines that allowed us to do that better? So how do we make sure that we are really creating a taxpayer-funded enterprise that ultimately serve the interests of the mission of the agency to support the science that led to better human health?
Yeah, and the US has a really long history of federally funded science that have led to some incredible breakthroughs and innovations, whether that be in medical or health, but some technology and such. How has that landscape of research funding? How has that changed over the last few decades, or maybe even as far back as maybe World War II, and some of the kind of the original thought around federally funded research and development?
So the story of our current kind of research ecosystem does in fact begin right after World War II, where Vannevar Bush, who was the science advisor to President Roosevelt, really created a vision in which the federal government would partner with scientists and research institutions that were outside of the government to be able to take advantage of the maximum capacity of U.S. brain power in a lot of ways, to take advantage of the infrastructure and the talents that already existed at research universities, at research institutions across the country, and partner with them in the scientific venture. And so this has been the system that really set the gold standard for the world. If you look at the history over the past 75 years since we started that great endeavor, we've seen a lot of imitation, being the sincerest form of flattery, from countries all over the world who have really followed that U.S. innovation model because it has worked so fantastically well. And what we have seen throughout the course of those, nearly 8 decades now of that research investment is a tremendous return on that investment, both in terms of advances in science and technology and things that improve the quality of our lives. So in the medical research space, the tremendous advancements we've seen in cardiovascular disease and cancer, in HIV/AIDS, and our fight against a number of diseases and conditions. And really, we've seen a exponential growth in science through that investment as well. A great example of that is the U.S. scientific enterprise supported now many years ago the investment in the Human Genome Project. And at the time, that seemed an almost impossible task, sequencing the entirety of the human genome. And it was a multi-federal agency investment. It involved scientific teams from all over the world. And what we've seen from that investment is really this explosion of return, both in terms of our technical capacities. So, now we have gotten to the point where you can sequence a human genome very quickly. Under $1,000 is very, very affordable. And we've seen the translation of that knowledge into, for example, cutting edge gene therapies, which once were really something that scientists only dreamed about and now are, of course, being approved and used to combat some of our thorniest diseases and conditions. So we've seen an incredible return on investment and really just a growth in the robustness of that enterprise.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of our researchers that we fund through the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust, they're doing some really interesting science. And as you talk to them, they will go back to kind of this point of when the genome was, kind of decoded. And do we have a good idea of what that return on investment is? Is it 10 times, 100 times? I mean, do we measure that as a federal government? Especially like on this example, I would be fascinated to know what that, just kind of estimate would be.
Yeah, so this has actually been looked at, and the Battelle Corporation, for example, has taken a look on this, and I think, and I am looking this up very quickly as we speak, that the investment is about 141 to 1. So every dollar we've invested, we've seen a recoup of $141. So that results in nearly $1 trillion worth of return on that investment for the Human Genome Project, which is a purely economic measure. I tend to think more in terms of both the tangible medical advancements that we've seen. So, for example, the gene therapies that I mentioned, the ability to have very targeted drugs against particular diseases that have a genetic cause, the advancements in gene editing that we've seen that are actively being used for therapies, and also just the hope that it provides. I think about a lot of the rare disease community that I've interacted with. So I am the mother of a child who unfortunately died of a rare disease. And as a result of that experience, I've had the great privilege of talking with a lot of families who have had similar experiences. And it was not that long ago where if your child was born with a disease where there was just a set of symptoms, you couldn't get a diagnosis for that disease. Right now, thanks to all of the investments we've made in genomics, people get answers. And that is the beginning of hope in a lot of ways, because once you have a diagnosis and once you have some concrete evidence about the causes of that disease, it gives you a really place to start the journey towards treatments, towards therapy, and hopefully someday towards a cure. And that hope is really important for people who have received a really terrible or life-changing disease diagnosis.
Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear about your child, and so I'm sorry to hear that. I'm sure it does give you a different perspective, and I'm glad you shared that, because I think people don't, a lot of people don't realize that some of these diseases don't get attention. They don't get funding attention, but there seems to be a shift in tide with that kind of understanding or that diagnosis, that now there's a rise of patient advocacy groups that are kind of coming together that can connect around the world to bring funding. Do you have anything to share on those thoughts?
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. I think we have seen a real growth in both patient advocacy and, frankly, patient participation. So the best research, in my opinion, is when patients are really partners in the research. And we're seeing more and more of that kind of thoughtful engagement, both from patient groups and research participants, but also from the scientific ecosystem. We're seeing a lot of scientists and federal agencies and even companies that are developing biotechnologies or therapies engaging more and more closely in partnership with patients. I think we still have a long way to go. I don't want to overstate that too much, but I think there has been a real and positive trend in that direction that is important. I think the other thing that we have really benefited from in terms of the investment we've made in science is the more we learn, the more we can begin to see those common threads on a biological basis between different diseases. So if I think about something like the Investment in the Brain Initiative, which I'm sure you've talked a lot about previously, which is really about developing the tools and the maps and this fundamental understanding from which we can then develop our knowledge to move towards solving our most pressing neuroscience problems and tackling neurodegenerative diseases. And some of what we're learning there is there may be more commonality between some of these neurodegenerative diseases than we imagined in the past. So different types of dementia, for example, may have some shared biological basis. And that's really important because it allows us to think about these therapeutic approaches in ways that are more cross-cutting. If we discover one disease is quite similar to another, and we have a therapy for disease number one, well, maybe that therapy or something similar will work for disease number two. And so these investments in fundamental understanding help really create sort of orders of magnitude of opportunity for addressing some of those diseases.
So, you went back the 75 years to kind of the maturation of the ecosystem that we have right now. And there's been a lot of growth, a lot of kind of splintering off, a lot of information that we've learned and knowledge that we've learned. But, we kind of find ourselves today in some questions of this ecosystem. And, I'm one of these that always kind of looks past the today into more what this could mean for the future or how this might all. But let's go ahead and kind of address some of these shifting political landscapes and budget priorities and, some of the things that we're kind of faced with as a nation here. How do you see federal research funding evolving, beyond today's headlines, but how do you see it evolving over the next decade? And really, what should researchers and those that support research, what should they be thinking about?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we're in mid-February 2025, and we're in the middle of a transition of administrations. And there is always some confusion and uncertainty related to any administration transition as we get new people on board and priorities are shifting. I would say that this particular administrative transition has been perhaps a little more dynamic and chaotic than some. But I think, the bigger picture, really thinking about where we have opportunities as a nation to build on the investments that we have already made. And I think there are a couple of ways to think about that. One is making sure that in sort of a push for change, for doing things better, that we don't lose sight of the stuff that works really well now, this partnership between the federal government and the private sector, and really investing that talent all across the nation in this very robust way that not only allows us to make scientific progress, but also allows us to stay competitive with the rest of the world, which is really important. Science is both a global endeavor in terms of cooperation. There are a lot of cooperative efforts all over the world, which are really important, but also competitive in a good way, because scientists in this global competition push each other to do things better and faster. And that does lead to innovation and growth in a positive way. I do think that there is a real sense coming off of what was a major world event in the global pandemic with COVID, that revealed some cracks in the system in terms of the way we think about public health at a population level. And that's everything from how we talk about public health, how we sort of engage as a scientific community as a global community and talk about science and its relationship to health in public spaces. But it also is about where is the intersection between federal investments and translation of those investments into health products, whether those are vaccines or therapeutics. I think we learned some really important lessons of where we could potentially accelerate research investments. It turns out that when society comes together to tackle one giant problem, as we did with COVID-19, we can make advances accelerate in really, really rapid fashion. And so there are opportunities to learn from that in the current ecosystem and think about, okay, what are some of the other hard challenges we could tackle? Maybe it's things in the chronic disease space. Maybe it is things in the health disparity space. Maybe it's intractable cancers. Some of these areas that have been pressing for a long time, neurodegenerative diseases where we haven't seen necessarily as much progress as we like. Could we take a look at the system as it is today and think about ways to accelerate that translational process so that we're getting advances into the hands of patients more quickly? How do we break down some of the silos, whether that's silos between the public and private sector, whether that is silos within the federal government, or whether that includes silos, even within a research institution. So, if anyone is familiar with large research universities, sometimes it's amazingly hard to connect, say, the biology department with the engineering department. But when they come together, really exciting potential advances could happen. And so I think there is an opportunity to rethink how we take the ecosystem of today, all of the lessons that we've learned in the past 75 years, and create a even better system for tomorrow. I'm a policy wonk. I love those kinds of problems. And I really think it is about bringing together all of the key stakeholders and identifying what are the obstacles currently in the system that are standing in the way of really tackling those big problems in the fastest, most efficient way possible. And I do think it is really important to have those and continually have those kind of big stakeholder conversations because, we want to preserve all of the things that has made American scientific innovation great for these many years, but also accept that we've seen a lot of advances in technology, in science, in who participates in research, right? So, post-World War II, the number of types of institutions that were available to do research was much smaller than what we see today, where really in all 50 states of the United States, we've got institutions, large and small, public and private, both universities and independent research institutions, different kinds of healthcare organizations, all coming together to participate in the research process. And how do we make sure that we are taking full advantage of that entire capacity in the best possible way? So I think we do have an opportunity to make the system better. But I will say, just in practical recognition, there are a lot of competing priorities right now on the national stage. There are big picture budget conversations happening. And so what's really important, I think, for the research community is continuing to communicate the importance of science and research and being part of that national conversation and being part of the positive national change. How can we harness the power of science and research to improve human health, to continue to create economic progress, to make the best use of that public-private partnership that is both the federal government and the entirety of the ecosystem in the private space?
Yeah, this next question is more just kind of educating me on some of the dynamics here because, you see the headlines around the cap on the FNA charge. And, to somebody that doesn't know, I sit here and I go, well, if you cap it, that means more money to the researchers and less to kind of the quote unquote, bureaucracy, administration piece of that. And if you do that, then it creates maybe this law of constraints. You have a little less money organizationally. Maybe this does innovate. Maybe there is more cross-boundary kind of conversations between, the engineering department and the biology department or such. Educate on why the FNA is important, why it's not okay or okay to cap it. And do you think there is some innovation that might come out of, just putting kind of a constraint on this, maybe even for just a while?
So F&A, or facilities and administration costs, are among some of the most wonkiest pieces of the research ecosystem to talk about. So these are sometimes called indirect costs, and they were really part of the system that we had talked about earlier, that Vannevar Bush built in sort of this vision of this grand public-private partnership for science. So in recognizing that the United States government was going to fund science at institutions, universities, hospitals all over the country, at some point it just became inefficient to try to negotiate, for example, the electricity needed in any one laboratory space, or a building needed for 5 different research projects, to try to do that on a grant by grant basis. If you look at something like the National Institutes of Health today, at any given time, they're thinking about hundreds of thousands of research grants. It doesn't really make sense for them to try to figure out, how many pennies of this are being dedicated to pay the electric bill, right? And so to solve that problem, essentially, the government began a process to negotiate the rates for all of these things that can't be attributed to any one specific research project, but are really the infrastructure overall that supports the totality of research in the United States. And the way that this works in the real world is universities or hospitals that participate and get funding from the federal government, they upfront the cost of research. They build the buildings that they need for laboratory space. They pay the technicians who are taking care of the lab animals. They pay to make sure that the right ethical committees are there to review research involving humans so that everything is being conducted responsibly. And then they take the receipts. Essentially, you can almost imagine a university showing up with a shoebox of receipts. And they take this to the federal government and they say, look, this is how much it costs us to support that infrastructure for this research partnership. And the federal government says, okay, well, we think that represents essentially X percentage of the total research that we're paying you. And so we are going to set a rate. And, from here until 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when we're going to check in again and make sure that's still the right amount of money, we are going to pay you an indirect cost rate to support that research. And that has essentially been the rules of the partnership for the federal government for some time. Now, I made that sound very easy. In the real world, that negotiation process, that imaginary shoebox of receipts, is in fact incredibly complicated. And there are hundreds and hundreds of pages of policy and regulation involving what's allowable, what's not allowable, what's a direct cost, what's an indirect cost. And there are many government agencies involved in doing these sort of, green eye shade negotiations. It's incredibly complicated and difficult to understand. And, ultimately, as time has gone on, research has also gotten more expensive. It's gotten more expensive because the buildings and facilities are more complicated. It's gotten more expensive because now we want our scientists, our federally funded scientists, to do a lot more in terms of sharing their data. We want them to have a lot of safeguards around security so that data isn't being misused inappropriately. We, added a lot more protections for people, for animals, for pathogens, because we really want to make sure that the research enterprise in the United States is responsible and safe and secure and all of the things we expect of our taxpayer-funded science. And as a result of that, we have seen a slight, although I will say it's been gradual for a very large number of years, increase in the cost of supporting this infrastructure. So what we saw recently from the current administration was a very sudden cap on these indirect costs. So a fixed percentage that was implemented. Now, the idea of an indirect cost cap is not new. It's come up many times throughout the year. In this case, the two notable things, and the reason why it has caused such a strong reaction in the research community is one, the cap percentage is for most institutions way lower than their current negotiated rate. So a lot of, and there's great variability among research institutions, but a lot of them have rates at around 50%. And I won't go into the math. It gets really complicated really fast, but we'll say it for simplicity, around 50%. And this was a 15%. So that's a big discrepancy in terms of how much infrastructure is being supported. In addition, the cap was implemented very suddenly. So it was released on a Friday and it went into effect on a Monday. And you remember I mentioned that these are reimbursements, right? So these are upfronted costs of the institution. They've budgeted around those. And so to implement a sudden cap on the rate causes a lot of turmoil. The way I like to think about it is if you've ever traveled for your employer on a work trip, you might put the cost of the airfare and your hotel on your personal credit card. And your expectation is your boss is going to reimburse you for those because it's a legitimate travel expense. And so imagine that you have done that. You've put this very expensive trip on your personal credit card and your boss suddenly says, sorry, I'm not going to pay you back. And you're left kind of holding the bag for these costs that you put out in a good faith, understanding that you would be reimbursed for them. That's kind of what happened here, where because it is a reimbursement, universities were upfronting the cost, continue to upfront the costs, and expected to be reimbursed for those costs. So the abruptness of the change is a major problem for institutions. Now, is a conversation about how do we, as a country, support the full cost of research, all the things that we want to do to make sure we're getting maximum return on the investment of our tax dollars. We should absolutely be having those conversations. That is a legitimate science policy question and one we should be continually revisiting. Are there ways we could, take advantage of regional facilities? Are there ways we could build efficiency into the system, make sure that we are investing in very rigorous science, the best kinds of clinical trials where we get the answer, with one shot instead of having to replicate it multiple times? Those are absolutely questions we should, as a country, be thinking about and talking about. But it's really about getting from point A to point B and figuring out what is the best roadmap to get there that science policy is all about at the end of the day. And so I think the conversation with indirect costs is hopefully going to get a place where we don't see this kind of disruptive change, but we see a legitimate conversation about how do we have a better enterprise that supports the kind of science that we are capable of as a country.
Yeah, and I appreciate you going through that because it gave clarity. My next question was, the abruptness. Does this allow for a door to open up with better communication, maybe even more, understanding, possibly transparency, whatever it may be, hopefully over the coming months, that process will start.
Yeah, I hope so. I tend to think that in the world of science and in the world of policy, can never have too much transparency and straightforward communication. I think a lot of times in my experience over the past couple of decades, some of the thorniest issues that we see in the science policy world are often caused by a misunderstanding, a lack of communication, people speaking sort of separate languages because of the communities that they are coming from. And often the answers are found in the middle of those missed communication opportunities. So for me, when I think of a problem to be solved in the science policy landscape, a lot of times the way I think about it is, okay, there's general consensus that we're at point A and it's not ideal. We want to get to point B, which is, the better world, whatever that looks like. And, who are all of the stakeholders who have a piece of this conversation, and how do we bring them together to figure out a way to move forward? I used to joke when I was in the federal government that I was really in charge of creating some of these overarching national policies that I knew I succeeded if I sort of made everybody a little bit unhappy and everybody a bit happy, right? So because that meant we met somewhere in the middle, and it is often those kind of compromise solutions that are really the best answers to move us forward.
Yeah, you've talked about communication a couple times, and I think you were saying about in this time of kind of disruption that scientists have to, and the research community needs to communicate better what they do. For me, there are so many people, so many organizations that seem to speak for science, speak for research, but maybe not have that background. I mean, who is responsible, and how do you know that the one that is speaking the loudest is really where you should be getting your information?
It's a tough question right now, in part because it's a challenging communications environment overall, sort of way bigger than science, certainly because of technology changes, because of the advent in different kinds of media and the way people receive information. It is just a more crowded and complicated information landscape out there. The positive side of it, what I like to see as the positive side of it, it allows for things like what we talked about earlier in patient engagement, for example. So, if you think about something like rare disease, if you think of a disease that maybe only affects 12 people around the world, it wasn't that long ago where, the families of those 12 people finding each other would have essentially been zero or very near impossible. In today's modern age, through social media, through the internet, you can bring together those, global communities around common problems like rare disease in ways that allow all sorts of possibilities. The downside of that, of course, is it has opened wide the channels of information in a way that has allowed the misuse of that sort of technology to spread misinformation, to spread disinformation. And it makes it really, really hard, particularly with the onslaught of information, because there's just a lot of competing conversations going on right now, to really be able to sort out the facts, to sort out the truth. And that has resulted in a real kind of erosion of trust in, certainly in science, which is what I think of, but really in institutions. So it's not so much a trust in science per se, but it's an erosion of trust in the institutions that, as you mentioned, tend to represent science. So whether that is federal science and research agencies or the people who represent them, or organizations that represent science, I am hesitant to say that is the same as a mistrust in science overall, because if you talk to people around your dinner table, if you read what people are interested in the news, there's still this vast hunger for science as a solution, right? People want the next technology advance that's going to address climate challenges, or that is going to cure cancer, or that is going to put better and healthier food on their table, right? Like there's a real appreciation that science is part of that solution, but that doesn't itself solve the problem of how do you make sure that the institutions that represent science are trusted by the public. Transparency is a lot of that, I think. Transparency and the ability to cut through some of the language barriers, the jargon, right? So scientists are really sort of infamous for using a lot of technical languages that doesn't convey to, the average person who may not come from that community. So how do we do a better job as a scientific community of explaining the science that we're doing, but also the process of science, right? So I think that's something we have as an entire nation and ecosystem gotten a little complacent about, is that people appreciated the science so much, we stopped explaining the how-to piece of it. How does the science get done? What is the scientific method? What is the role of the federal government in supporting science? How do we know that we can trust the data that is coming out of the scientific method? And so I think now is an opportunity to really think about how do we, as an entire ecosystem of scientific institutions, federal agencies, do a better job of bridging that communications gap and making sure we're explaining not only the science, but the process and the method behind that science.
Yeah, I love that because I tended, where I'm at is the more that's out there, somewhere along the way, trust will be built. If we just allow for these, not shut down any voices, but trust will be built. I think there's also what you said is really important is that process of science being translated then to commercial kind of outcome, to products, to therapies or medical devices. I think we're a society, especially in the United States, where we get a new iPhone comes out every year. We get, upgrades. It happens really quick. But science is the banking of, it takes a long time and we've got to bank this and it may not get translated for a while. Can you kind of share your thoughts there on to think about that and how that might be changing?
That's exactly right. And I think, an important part of this story of the American model of supporting science, this Vannevar Bush sort of ecosystem, is the recognition that the private sector is not inclined to invest in sort of the fundamental discoveries, the really curiosity driven basic research and science that doesn't have a immediately visible sort of commercial outcome, right? They're interested in creating and developing products that can move into the marketplace and ultimately profit the private sector company. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of the system, our economic system in the United States. But the recognition that took place as part of Vannevar Bush's vision is that if the federal government supports the fundamental research, that sort of curiosity-driven investment, or large infrastructure investments like we've talked about, the BRAIN Initiative, the Human Genome Project, then there can be a handoff into the private sector, which will then take charge in developing those downstream products and technologies, medicines, devices, vaccines, diagnostics from that point forward. And so that's a really important part of the partnership, but it requires, the right incentivization on both sides of that equation, making sure that we have both that robust research investment, but making sure we also have the sort of portfolio balance as a nation to invest in all of the pieces that allow that smooth handoff, that we have all the pieces in place to be able to translate from that kind of fundamental research stage to ultimately the stuff that helps move our progress forward. And I think that's where we have the biggest opportunity to make changes in the system and really make sure that we are taking advantage of all of the things we've learned in the technology space, in really thinking about how do we bring public and private partners together to accelerate that handoff in the best possible way? Are there ways we can streamline the regulatory process? And all of that, I think, requires making sure we have, as part of this whole federal system, an investment in the talent that really drives those conversations within the federal research agencies. And I think, while we've talked a little bit about some of the chaos and concern going on in the transition, I think, it's certainly of concern to me that in some of the efforts that I think are really aimed at streamlining and making the federal part of this partnership more efficient, we've seen a heavy-handed approach to reducing the federal workforce in a way that may not lend itself to that improved efficiency, because we really need to have the subject matter experts on both sides of the federal and private table to make sure we are thinking about and solving those parts in the system that are not as efficient as we would like them to be.
Yeah, well, maybe there's an opportunity for it to swing back a little bit with all the debates that will take place. How should philanthropists and foundations and kind of that nonprofit, how should they be, looking at the landscape and I'm curious because of the trust, right? The KTCT. How should we be kind of reading the tea leaves here, and what should we be doing, or what should we prepare ourselves for?
When I think about where foundations and philanthropists can really fill the spaces, I think one, they have the opportunity to maybe invest in things that fill in the gaps of changing government priorities, right? So one of the, axioms of the United States is, because we have a constantly changing political system, we have sort of shifting priorities every few years as part of that political cycle. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It allows adjustments. It allows us to tackle problems as they emerge. But it also means sometimes that things get left on the cutting room floor. And so that is an opportunity for philanthropies and foundations to maybe fill in some of those gaps and pick up things that are abandoned priorities, or raise up things that maybe haven't become priorities of the federal government yet. So that's certainly one thing. The other thing is, I think we sometimes have this great longing for the scientific enterprise to really put a lot of bets on risky research, right? The idea that we want things that are going to move the needle in big ways and take advantage of high risk opportunities. The federal system, as much as we long for that, and as much as we have started to move some of our agencies in that direction, for example, the Advanced Research Project Agency for Health, ARPA-H, is a good example of an agency set up to make some of those higher risk investments. Truthfully, as taxpayers, as sort of a policy machinery, we're of mixed minds about that, right? Because we want the agencies to be accountable and really show the value of their investment, which tends to push them in the direction of making kind of sure bet investments, right? The kind of incremental day-to-day science that we know really does over time build the foundation on which a lot of opportunities are built. And that's important too. And so the opportunity that foundations and philanthropists can sometimes bring to the table is thinking about, okay, where are those riskier paradigm shifting investments? Maybe that's investments in people who have really out of the box, wild ideas that you want to take a chance on. Maybe that's investing in team approaches that are non-traditional, back to that idea of maybe it's, a biologist, an engineer, and an urban planner walk into a bar and, have a solution for a built environment that solves, obesity or dementia in a way that would be very hard for either the federal government or, the traditional private sector industry to do. And then finally, I think, that people piece is really important. The ability to invest in that next generation of scientists and researchers who are going to keep driving the innovation engine and forward. I think particularly with a lot of uncertainty in the federal landscape, as we go through the transition, as we think about our economic priorities as a country, it can be a scary time to be a young scientist. And so, creating those opportunities of support for those young innovators who are really going to bring the next generation of ideas, I think is a really important place for the nonprofit sector in particular to invest. And you'll get a lot of bang in your, for your buck in those kinds of investments in people.
Yeah, that's amazing, and it really kind of hits home to, who I represent and who I am. So I appreciate that. What words of encouragement can you give some of these researchers that are early in their career? They've just gone through, 16 years of education, and they're kind of looking at this and going, oh my goodness, and I don't know if I'm going to have a career here. What do you say to them? And then to add to that, we have these young researchers that are here from all over the world that are, studying and being a part of this ecosystem. What do you say to them?
So it's an incredibly challenging time for a lot of reasons. And, I recognize that, like I said, it is a scary time to be thinking about what is my future if you are a bright young innovator who is entering this landscape. You're watching a lot of scientists in the federal government lose their job. There are risks and certainties about federal funding. But the, glass half full optimist in me, of which I very much am, I think there's a lot of optimism built into science itself, right? Would say that it is hard to imagine that a lot of the solutions to the really big problems we face as a country, as a global society, that science isn't part of the solution. When I think about the big picture problems that tend to keep me up at night, the next emerging pandemic, the rapidly changing climate, the notion of food insecurity for our country, for the planet, science absolutely has to be part of the solutions for those, problems that are so big that it's hard to wrap your arms around them. And as long as science is going to be inherently necessary for those solutions, then I have no doubts that at some point the pendulum has to swing back towards strong support for science, for research. And so that leads me to, sort of the hope of this too shall pass. I am someone who hopes that that pendulum swings very quickly because science is really a generational endeavor. Every discovery builds on the discoveries before. You mentioned people who spend, 16 years training, right? It's not something you enter into lightly. And every little bit of delay sets us back sort of exponentially because of that, because we can't really afford to lose a generation of scientists. We can't afford to lose a generation of incremental investment. So it's really important that, we keep our eye on the ball and really focus on making the case for that continued research and innovation investment in people, in the science itself, in those policies and processes that support the people and the science to really tackle some of these challenges in an evidence-based, deliberative way, because we really can't afford to step away from that as a country.
Yeah. Well, I know you're very active in the debate. You're very active in the discussion and the communication, and not only are you putting facts out there, but you're also putting out hope. As you're doing your role now, and whatever role you do next, what's kind of the one thing that you would like to focus on or change that kind of puts us on that future course that you've talked about? Is there something that you're pretty passionate about that we need to work and pay attention to?
So I would really like to be able to see us form a new national vision for public health in this country. I think, we did learn a lot of lessons through the COVID experience, and it's really easy. And I think what's going on now as part of the national conversation to dwell on some of the negative lessons, the things that didn't work well, the things, that people have strong negative feelings about. But there was a lot of things that happened that either worked phenomenally well in terms of accelerating therapeutics, countermeasures, vaccines, that sort of thing, or where we revealed solutions that we might not otherwise have seen had we not pressure tested the system. I think from a science and technology point of view, we are in a very good place to address the next and future emerging infectious disease threats head on, to really be able to fulfill what's called the 100-day mission, the idea that within 100 days of a new threat being identified, we would be ready with vaccines or therapies or whatever the appropriate countermeasure is to tackle that. It's not a problem of science. It's a problem of all of the things around the science, the policy, the institution, the political will. And so, my big dream going forward that I would really love to see, in my professional lifetime, certainly, is how do we take all of those lessons learned and come back stronger, both as a country and as a world, to create the really rigorous public health system that allows us to address those emerging public health threats and really do a better job as an entire country in tackling those kinds of problems, in really creating the landscape in which those scientific seeds can be planted and flourish in a real way.
Yeah, I hope that we can have those dialogues too, and have conversations rather than a lot of finger pointing. As a half glass full, would that be your greatest hope for the future then, when you think about the next 5, 10, 15 years, or what is that greatest hope?
So yes, that would be up there for sure, because I think built within that are sort of sub-hopes, if you will. To achieve that vision, I think it does really require thinking about what is the next national vision for science and research. How do we bring together all these threads we've been talking about? The cultivating the right talents, making the right investments, creating the infrastructure to accelerate those scientific discoveries into the real world. It's about bringing together partnerships between patients, between communities, between the federal governments and, the state and local governments, between public and private sectors, a lot of way. All those things are going to have to happen in order to achieve that bigger public health vision. And I think it creates, in some ways, a model potentially to solve other really big problems, whether that's, again, climate change, whether it is economic security, whether it is the next national security challenge or food security for the planet. I think all of those are really based on having the next vision, just as Vannevar Bush did, almost 80 years ago, for what does the future of science and technology in the United States look like in a way that benefits the country and the entire world.
Yeah, thank you for that. So as we wrap up here, how do people, if they're energized, they want to talk to you, get in contact, bring their passion to maybe this vision, how do people get in contact with you?
Well, I am pretty easy to find on LinkedIn. That's usually the best way to get a hold of me. I do pay attention to messages there. I'm actually pretty easy to find. You can Google me fairly easily. I'm currently a senior partner at Lewis Burke Associates, and I'm contactable through that venue as well.
Wonderful. I really appreciate your time. I've got some clarity on what some of the things that are going on right now and why it's important, and really what to kind of think about it kind of going forward. So I really appreciate your time, your experience, your passion, your dedication. So thank you very much for the time today.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you, and hopefully we will continue this thread of optimism into the national conversation, even as we get through sort of an extremely challenging time right now.
Thank you for joining Research Renaissance. For more information and to stay updated, subscribe for more episodes and visit our website at tofflertrust.org. Feel free to call us if you have any thoughts, suggestions, or just want to find out more about the Karen Toffler Charitable Trust. Until we meet again, onward and upward.